Just in case you're wondering where I'm doing my chronicles, this is actually in some kind of a library, sofa, living room, desk, office, or whatever. Everything is here. Actually, you have a kitchen on my left side, you have my office desk on the right side, one of my office desks anyway, and then at my back you had some of my books, although there are other shelves here where you have more of my books. I don't know how many thousands there are now at this time. You know how it is. When you walk around, it's actually the bookstore that calls me to go inside. I could hear them all shouting, "Buy me, buy me." Anyway, at my back, perhaps you could see the picture frame. This is where I put my choice frames. One of them is with Mother Teresa. This was a brief interview, not really an interview, a conversation I had with Mother Teresa, Saint Mother Teresa, at Malacanang when she came to visit our country. And I sat there with her where she was waiting to be received by both President Ferdinand E. Marcos and Imelda Marcos. And so we sat there, and whether, that portion of her life or that part of her has been talked about or revealed by anyone, we were actually having fun talking about many things, like how it was in Calcutta, how she got into the nunnery, and several other things of her childhood, and we were laughing most of the time. She had a very good sense of humor. That's the photograph I have behind me, and a little over on top of her I have another photograph with another saint, and you know how it is. That was the meeting that the first time that there was a call to the audience with the Holy Father, and there was a big delegation from our country. And by some strange event that happened inside that quarters where the Holy Father receives guests, we were not actually part of that delegation. We were part of the coverage of that television. So we were with my camera and my camera crew and myself. And so only the VIPs actually entered the room for the audience with the Holy Father. But he saw us peeping, at the door, and so he said, why don't you come in? And so the Cardinal Protocol Officer gestured to the guard and said, "You let them in." And that was what the photograph is all about. Instead of the rosaries that he was giving to the VIPs that were calling on him from our Philippine delegation, he gave us little Santo Niño statues. And these were images, and he said, he's colored brown. He said something of the sort. Anyway, so I had two saints here. The photographs I had with Mother Teresa and his Holy Father, and the Holy Father, both of them already canonized as saints. And that's why there is a joke going around here in the house that maybe I could be a relic, isn't it? When people touch the holy things or the garments and the clothing of those who have been declared saints, they are already considered as relics. So I have here two of them actually, and these are my cherished photographs. Anyway, last episode I had with the Chronicles, I mentioned something about the coverage of how it was during the time of Ferdinand Marcos covering the president. Very different from the way it's undertaken now. Let's go now to the coverage of the First Lady at the time, Imelda Marcos. Well, I was contracted only to cover the office of the president, which was Ferdinand E. Marcos. I had no contract to cover Imelda Marcos, but I was also tasked, in addition to my work covering Marcos, to also cover Imelda Marcos whenever she was going on a foreign travel, when she had a foreign mission, some diplomatic assignment that was given to her by Ferdinand Marcos. So, in effect, there was another lady, several other ladies, as a matter of fact, who did the daily coverage of Imelda Marcos as she was going about her many projects. But in some of them, I also had been requested to do some kind of a special report, or maybe a mini documentary, if you'd call it. Like, for instance, when she had this international conference on the survival of humankind, which was some kind of a dry run for the Philippine International Convention Center, where I was requested to do some work regarding that. It was actually Mrs. Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, Tita Chita as you would call her, who got me to interview the scientists that were invited for the international conference, because she also asked me to do the editing of their scientific work so that this could be best understood in layman's language. So you can imagine volumes and volumes of their work and the discussions that they were going to have at the International Convention Center. I had to reduce it to something like 1 or 2 pages, and these were given out of, for the press and all of this. But nonetheless, that was how I got into the covering you would call it, what a term, a covering of Imelda Marcos. And that was first the survival of humankind, which was actually a precursor to the habitat which was organized by the United Nations. And then after that, she was invited to the General Assembly to speak there on behalf of the Philippine government. Normally, regularly it was the Foreign Affairs Minister or the President himself of the country. But this time it was Mrs. Marcos who was invited, precisely because of what happened here in Manila, where she had this meeting of about 75 foreign scientists discussing the survival of humankind. You had NASA, you had geophysicists, you had those who were already predicting climate change, the ecology, and several other things. So that was why her speech at the General Assembly was the new human order, which had nothing to do with politics or had nothing to do with military might or anything to do with the way countries were fighting each other or anything to do with what we have to understand as far as the United Nations is concerned, but she zeroed in on what we could do for humanity itself, and that was part of the consequence of what she did here in the Philippines with the Ministry of Human Settlements eventually. So that was the first time that I had a foreign mission coverage of Imelda Romualdez Marcos and her speech at the United Nations, which we were going over several times until I gave the comment that perhaps we should edit it a little bit because it seemed a little too stiff and a little like it was written for a man or something. And I understand, of course, might have offended whoever wrote that speech, because President Marcos asked me, why are you complaining about the speech? And I said, it's very difficult to even read, because there is no fluidity, and Mrs. Marcos would be able to express it better if perhaps we could edit it a little so that it would, it would blend with the way a woman talks. And so that was how it was. And so we had to rehearse this a couple of times, and I remember that maybe she also felt a little slighted in a way, because I would have to tell her this is how it goes, the pacing, etc., and all of this. But that was the first time that I covered her for a foreign mission. But I met her several years back. I was talking earlier about my other chronicle about having met Ferdinand Marcos during the presidential campaigns in 1965. Now let's go back to how I met Imelda. Well, for the National Convention of the Nacionalista Party, they had to get the votes of the delegates, and my father, who happened to be the chairman of some provinces in Mindanao, was carrying with him 10 other delegates, and that is why Imelda came over to talk to my father. But my father refused to talk to her because he was already committed. He was supporting Hil Puyat for the convention that was going to be held among the Nacionalista Party delegates. And Mrs. Marcos came to, she was still the Senate President's wife. She came to our old house, to our family home in Tomas Morato. This was the house on the hill. I've written about this. The house on the hill was one of the tallest houses you could see in Tomas Morato because it was on top of the hill. And now you would see it as one of the tallest buildings you have in Tomas Morato after they sold that place. But anyway, she went there, sat in the lanai, and said she would wait for my father, thinking that he was, well, of course, that was the excuse we said, that he was out of the house. But my father was just upstairs. And so she said, I will wait for him. And believe it or not, she waited for more than 2 hours, close to 3 hours, as a matter of fact. And my father upstairs would say, I am not going down because I've already made my commitment and I don't want to be persuaded otherwise. But he had no choice because she would not leave. And so she sat there patiently for about 3 hours, and that was the first time I met her. I was not even voting age at the time. Remember that voting age at the time was 21, and I was not yet quite 21. I was only, I think, about 17 and a half, or just about to be 18 years old at the time. And so we discussed about my life, and she said, what are you doing after college? And so I said, well, perhaps, I would go into postgraduate studies and so forth. Then she talked about Ferdinand Marcos and said he's an outstanding senator, talked about his being able to defend himself by himself when he was not even a law graduate, and several other highlights of Ferdinand Marcos' life. For 3 hours she was talking. I was listening to her and really saying, oh my God, I hope my father comes down. And he did. Finally, my father came down, and believe me, in 30 minutes, Mrs. Marcos was able to convince him. So that was it. He swayed his votes, all 10 delegates of them, in favor of Ferdinand Marcos during the national conventions. That was the first time I met Imelda. 3 hours, prior to the 3 hours waiting to get my father's vote and 10 other delegates for the convention, which actually proclaimed Ferdinand Marcos as the official candidate of the Nacionalista Party. So let's fast forward, and then it was already the coverage that was needed for her diplomatic mission to the United Nations, the first time that she would address the General Assembly. That's normally at around September or October, and that was it. So New York, oh my goodness. What a wonderful way to visit New York at the time of the year. This is autumn, and just about the best season when it's not really too cold and it's not too warm. It's just a perfect season actually when the leaves turn gold and red and all the colors that the autumn season would bring. So anyway, after that, what happened was any other diplomatic and foreign mission that she was assigned to do, then that was the coverage I had to undertake for her. So you can imagine, everybody thought that I was doing things for Mrs. Marcos, and no, it was only for her foreign missions and her foreign travels whenever she had to address certain groups, for instance, like if she was invited by the New York, commerce, what do you call this, institutions and so forth, in Japan, for instance, for the Keidanren, when she was invited also for several addresses. And then, of course, the more difficult of her diplomatic missions, which was in Libya, and then in, well, of course, the one with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and of course, our first opening of our not really just the opening, but our first foreign visit to the People's Republic of China and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. These were very critical foreign missions, and by some blessing in a way, and I was really very happy to have been part of the delegation of those that would be covering these diplomatic missions of Mrs. Marcos. How was it like? Well, as far as the Malacanang day-to-day affairs were undertaken by her in her different projects, I just hear about this from the reports undertaken or done by those covering her actually. So they would be doing the PICC coverage, for instance, and all the other buildings she was constructing, the Ministry of Human Settlements, her visit to different bliss housing, etc. But it is in the foreign missions where I really got to see her up close, personal and professionally. And so one of the first actually that was most difficult, of course, the United Nations was something which was really breathtaking in a way. Because you can imagine her entrance into the General Assembly was something where everybody stood up, because the first time that you had the First Lady of any country that would be addressing the United Nations. And so that was really awesome for them. And we did a live coverage of it from one of the studios you had in the United Nations. This is just one room and one camera, and there's nobody else. And that's you were given a sign that if the camera blinks this way, that means you're on. So that was how it was. We had a live coverage of that particular event, and that was really something which I still honor up to this day. Anyway, as I said, some of the most difficult and critical missions were for the communist countries at the time. You must remember that during the, well, 60s, 70s, 80s even, we were, how would you call this, diametrically divided. The whole world was divided between communism and democracy. So you had the United States of America and its democratic allies, and then you had the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and its allies. China was still winding up its Cultural Revolution and gaining ground only for its unification, and eventually to become, I'm doubling my words, eventually to become a world power in a way as far as our region is concerned. But at that time it was Russia, the Russian Federation, which was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with several of those republics still part of the Soviet Union. So that was the first of our difficult, in a way, because we were going against what Washington really were thinking of the Philippines as the little brown brother or the American ally. So with that actually began many of the other difficult missions that we had, which was after the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, our first visit to Moscow, and then eventually the state visit of President Marcos to open our diplomatic relations. And then there was Libya, and then there was Iraq. Libya was one of the most difficult because, as I've already mentioned some time back, it was, in a way, a country which was supporting our rebels in the south for independence, with logistical support, with ammunitions, with spiritual support. And for 3 days, that as soon as we arrived in Tripoli, we already felt the hostility in the air, because for 3 days, well, Colonel Gaddafi did not meet with the delegation or with Mrs. Marcos, and that is the reason why Secretary Enrile of the Defense Department and General Ramos left Mrs. Marcos and flew to Rome and told the President, well, I think nothing's going to happen in Libya, but she decided to stay one more day and indeed, tried to find out how she can be able to meet with Gaddafi without offending any of their other officials. And so she went to the father. She went to the father of Colonel Gaddafi, who was living out there in the desert in a big tent, air-conditioned with chandeliers and fully carpeted, and said something like, I come in peace and I would like to meet with your son, but it has been 3 days that we've been here. And soon enough, as soon as we got back to Tripoli, there was the Secretary of Gaddafi, Secretary Al-Traki, Secretary of State, who said, the President Gaddafi is now going to meet with you. And that began already what we know as the Tripoli Agreement, which was signed between the Philippines and Tripoli, and of course with the attendance of several of those that were actually working on this particular Tripoli Agreement. Colonel Barbero, the Undersecretary of Defense, likewise was working on this. Colonel Ermita, who was his aide, is still alive. You can interview him or talk to him and ask him how it was that we were able to get through Mrs. Marcos that particular agreement, where from 1976 until 1986 we had peace in Mindanao. 2 regions of 9 and 12, 10 provinces and 5 cities where the rebel movement was actually almost kept quiet all the time. So other diplomatic missions were just as exciting and also just as wonderful, if you could call it that. And that was how I would say that the coverage of Imelda Romualdez Marcos is something that we could chronicle for the rest of our lives, because they opened the doors not only of the countries which were heretofore communist. We raised the veil of the Middle Eastern countries, where we also visited all the Middle Eastern countries and had diplomatic relations with them. We opened the doors of the bamboo curtain, and we broke the doors of the Iron Curtain, which was the Soviet Union. That is how it goes, and perhaps in other chronicles we could go into the details of these different diplomatic missions, and that was how it goes as far as the coverage of Imelda Romualdez Marcos is concerned on Rita Gadi's Chronicles.